Hello everyone, it's your favorite linen seller. Um and today is finally the day where I talk about Capital Volume 1. I finally finished reading it. This is the longest non-religious text that I've ever read. Um because I don't know. Yeah, I think people just expect religious texts to be long, so I'm not counting the Christian Bible, the Tanakh, or the Quran. Uh, and yeah, guys, as you can clearly see, I have the special cerebral palsy edition with ripped pages because um well, yeah, that's what happens when I read soft cover books. At least you know I actually read it because if it wasn't in this shape, then I'd be lying to you guys. Um, but yeah, and as you can see, this is the Penguin edition, which I think dates to around the 1970s. But it's based on the um version prepared and originally translated by Eleanor Marx, Marx's daughter, and her husband, who um I believe was named Edward or Richard Aveling. He was a British man. But yeah, anyway, guys, so um what did I think? Well, I have to say that I'm impressed, number 1, and number 2, um glad that I read Hegel first because it's interesting the way Marx not only critiques um Hegel through his saying like, hey man, the way we essentially, this is an oversimplification. It's obviously not this simple, but what I got from it was like, hey man, the way we make stuff um and work and essentially labor affects the way in which we deal with each other as people in societies, and even goes further than that. Like, it affects the way society is built in general, right? And it's built for a certain class of people that is capitalist against the people that do the actual work. And but when I see that he builds upon Hegel a little bit too, in the very beginning chapters, he compares it to Peter and Paul, right? When he's talking about commodity sellers and commodity makers, he says they confront each other, um, as subjective beings with certain interests, which is usually to make money and eventually turn that money into capital so they can make more products and keep repeating the cycle to make products and earn a profit, which is usually gained through exploiting the labors of others through their surplus value. So there's some time, right, that a capitalist has to spend money so that you can, um, pay for housing, pay for your food, right? The basic necessities. Although, and nowadays, I would say maybe that's not even the case with the way things are right now. Thankfully, I'm a cripple, so I've rarely, if ever, had to deal with that. Although I will eventually, because I do want to like start working. But the tricky thing for me is that, as I've said before, I have to go directly to the upper middle class, and I'm building that. That's the only choice I have in this system. Um, but the analogy to Peter and Paul, I think, is still um actually low key genius. Not gonna lie, because if any of you know your Pauline epistles, what did Paul say to Peter, bro? He says in Galatians 2, um I rebuked Cephas to his face. And yeah, uh among two people with subjective and often um differing interests, like Peter and Paul on the question of eating with Gentile, at that time, Gentile Christians, um eventually you're gonna get class conflict as well. um and I don't know, it seems like the I guess materialist version of Hegel's master slash servant dynamic, except the focus here is of course on the person that exploits the labor versus the person that is being exploited. Um and so yeah, I like many others would probably recommend reading the Phenomenology of Spirit first. Um cuz it'll definitely help you if you want to understand this puppy right here. Um and yeah, guys, it's about what, like 1,100 pages, especially this edition, because this edition contains the unfinished part, which, excuse me, I was honestly a little bit confused, but I think it was originally supposed to be part um 6 or 7 of the current edition of Volume 1, Results of the Process of Production. Um, but yeah, on a different note, outside of its philosophical content, I was pretty surprised, although not really, because I already knew that Marx lived a huge chunk of his life in Britain. And Britain at that time, if you don't know, was the most advanced industrial nation in the world. Um and um yeah, almost all of the sources, and there are literally thousands of sources in here, I think. If we're just going by footnotes, it's probably close to 1,000. Because some chapters literally have close to 200 footnotes with sources and stuff like that. And they're mostly British sources, which again, Marx did most of his research, I think, at the British Museum, which when I found that out, I was like, wow, the British Museum has really been stealing stuff for that long. uh, but nah. Yeah, so, but it also kind of makes sense, if you consider again the fact that, like, Britain was the most industrially advanced um nation at the time that this was uh published and written, which I think this book was written around about 1859, 1860 to 1867 when it was finally published. So, um, yeah, it was just also a really interesting historical overview because a few parts of the book, um, literally just go over the excesses of capitalism. So it talks a lot about the British Factory Acts and stuff like that that tried to mend the terrible condition of men, women, and children under like unregulated capitalism. Um, and that was like I'm grateful that we have such a record. Like on a personal level, and can I also just want to say that for as much as people like to say that this book is quote unquote boring, and I would agree that maybe the more like I guess drier sections, which are just kind of um dealings of parliament and the factory acts and stuff like that, I can see that, right? There are a whole bunch of reports from the Children's Commission, um which are sometimes just literally quoted outright in footnotes or in the main text. But like, to be honest, I found the analysis actually pretty entertaining. Marx is like extremely witty. He's sassy, bro. And yeah, you should look into the parts where he talks about the adulteration of bread that that bakers, especially, as they started to get integrated into the capitalist and industrial system, did. He's like, oh yeah, the workers love their yummy yummy alum and stuff like he doesn't say yummy yummy, but the tone is clearly sarcastic, bro. Marx is I hope that if I ever write a groundbreaking uh philosophical text, that I can be as snarky as Marx, cause you know who he reminds me of? Max Weber a little bit. He has the same kind of like, let's be honest, arrogance about him, but it's funny. uh, there were um also occasional parts that were inserted by Engels later on in the fourth edition, which this is the text that I have is based on. I didn't really like Engels' writing style all too much, honestly. Um, but yeah, Marx is great. Marx is great. And finally, I was surprised to see one of the final chapters being about colonialism. And this is where I'm gonna get kind of personal eventually. I just want to say that it's mainly a commentary on the works of E.G. Wakefield. Um, primarily, like, I mean, basically any part of this book could be its own separate book. In fact, I think he um Marx eventually published what was meant to be volume 4 of Capital as a work called Theories of Surplus Value. Um but but yeah, I recognize a lot in my own life because you know I was born into the bourgeoisie class of um a former, some would say current, well, a former colony of Spain, a current client state slash colony of the United States, Guatemala. Um and but the thing is, when I came when my family came to the US, our position changed, right? We were, or not me, my parents became poor migrant workers. I mean, guys, in Guatemala, my dad literally owned a cleaning supplies factory. He owned the means of production. My great grandfather and Enrique Melgar de la Cerda was um head of Guatemala's central bank in the 1940s, and his brother was, I think, Ministro de Haciendas y Crédito, Minister of Estates and Credit. So, yeah, and his grandmother was a disabled feminist. She was in a wheelchair like me, although, what I have isn't primarily genetic, it's more or less environmental. Um but yeah, who she did marry into the upper classes because she was her, like, one of her parents passed away and stuff like that. And but like, um and if you guys know anything about, like, Spanish royals and stuff like that, the De las Cerdas were, or I think they are, descendants of Alfonso el Sabio from, like, the 13th century. So there's a connection there. I think they were counts of Burgundy. Um and so, but my Mama Chenta, as we call her, was actually, she was a Ladina. She was mixed. She just married into the aristocracy, basically. Um, and but yeah, and then my great grandfather on my dad's side, um, his family, his father's family owned, they were petite bourgeoisie. They owned a chain of pharmacies in Guatemala City, which eventually, once again, enabled him to marry into even greater circles, right? He married my Mama Chenta's daughter, Ana, and so did my great grandfather, because my great grandfather, who was again mixed, married a criolla, a Spaniard born in Guatemala. My Loti, my bisabuela Loti, who, her parents, one came from a land owning family, the Diaz Barrios family in Solola, Panajachel, right? And from San Lucas Toliman, and you know and her father was actually a Gibraltarian, so he spoke Llanito, which is like European Spanglish, essentially. Um and so yeah, I mean, my another side of my family, well, my grandfather was consul to Costa Rica in Guatemala. And then my mom, among other things, because he was also a banker and a financier, pretty much like my great grandfather. He had his own financial firm. He was in the military. He went to La Escuela Politécnica, which is the most prestigious military school in Guatemala. Um, but I think he was a refugee from the Costa Rican conflict. And my mom, she came from a kind of poor but kind of still well off family. Where I would compare it to what Marx says is like the capitalist farm. Excuse me, the capitalist farmer. He has an entire chapter about that, where it's like, yeah, he had his land. He was a cattle herder. He had his land. This is my mother's father. Um, he had servants, indigenous servants, not as much as my dad's family. But they would do basic stuff and um clean around the house. It's funny because in here in the US, and I know this again because my parents did this type of work. We're the ones that do that type of work for for um for quote unquote white people or people with money, right? Um but yet when um mestizos with a little bit of money, or Ladinos as we're called in Guatemala, um we use indigenous people to do that. Um so you can kind of see how again the dynamics repeat themselves even in quote unquote middle income countries. My mom herself became a model for Cerveza Gallo, which if you guys don't know, that's like the most famous beer brand in Guatemala. And through a lot more other stuff, accidents of life, many jobs, she was actually pretty tight with her first husband, with Vinicio Cerezo, who was like the first post democracy president in Guatemala in the mid 80s, I think. So bottom line is that my family was maybe not the wealthiest. Like we weren't let's say like the owners of Pollo Campero, the restaurant chain, the Gutierrez's, but we were up there. We were up there for sure. And I don't know, but then when we came to the US, that all changed. Like I told you guys, I grew up in Holiday, Florida, the not nice parts of Florida, of Holiday, Florida. Um and we were kind of lower middle class as long as my parents were together, but once they separated and stuff like that, and like um we just became even poorer. And my I was mainly raised, guys, by my brothers, to be honest with you, mainly because my parents were working so hard, especially my mom. And I barely saw my parents for most of my childhood and adolescence. It was a very lonely, uh, experience for me, because as my brothers got older, I obviously saw less of them too, and then one of them moved back to Guatemala, and obviously there was the my documentation, or my family's documentation situation, let's say, wasn't the best. But these are the types of experiences which eventually did radicalize me. um and I'm glad that I'm not alone. And I just want to say, guys, I'm not excusing my family's exploitation of in Guatemala specifically, because that didn't happen in here in the US. But like, I'm not excusing their exploitation. I'm just, talking a little bit about my family history. I like, I've reckoned with that, and but I mean, I'm privileged in a way, not only because my family eventually got out of that situation, but because, unlike other poor people here, um uh the poverty that I experienced wasn't generational. It wasn't the only thing that I knew, or at least that my parents knew. They always knew there was a better world out there, right? And so, especially my dad, this is where my dad comes in clutch. Not only did he raise us as a time, in terms of having his presence there, although it wasn't much, like I said, but he, like, always made sure that, you know, we could ask him intellectual questions, and that we knew that, like, we shouldn't be defined by our environment. And that's something that, for example, your average poor person in the US, or a poor person anywhere really, and especially in the global south, doesn't really have access to. um because it's different when, your dad was literally the owner of, excuse me, a cleaning supplies factory, and could tell you about engineering, math, science, art, and who literally went to Liceo Guatemala, which is like a really good school in Guatemala even to this day, and who traveled to the US and all of these different countries, and who was an encyclopedia salesman, and, you know, whose, again, mother also touched arms and stuff with very high up people in society, and like, in Guatemala. And like, even just hearing those stories, despite our position within the imperial core, because during the summers when we would go up to my to visit my mom, we lived in like Langley Park, Maryland, Riverdale, Maryland, Tacoma Park, Maryland, and they're a lot better today, guys. But like, I'll give you an example. When my maternal grandfather migrated to the US in the 80s, we, and of course, this is a little bit of a coincidence, but also not really. We ended up with my mom during the summers, eventually living in the exact same apartment. Not the apartment building, the exact same apartment, guys. 25 years apart. How is that not systemic? Uh, Racism. How is that not, guys? And remember, Maryland was a part of the historical South. They come a long way, but come on now, bro. Come on now. Don't pretend as if Prince George's County and Moco aren't de facto separated. And that was pretty much the case in Florida too, man. Like it was a little bit more integrated, but like not by much. And you know, Marx talks about how after a certain point, especially if it's cheaper with free trade and all of these other things, that's what happened, you know. The upper classes need a lower class of a quote unquote lower class of people, usually migrants, to do all the stuff that the the wealthier people think is above them. And there's no greater way to do that, to get that, than a colony. And I mean, my parents came um specifically because there were no resources for me in Guatemala despite our wealth. And so, and that can largely be due, or is due, in my opinion, to the various forces, colonial forces, um, the US conspiring to not allow Guatemala to develop as it should have. Um, Specifically the 1954 Guatemalan coup of Jacobo Arbenz. Now, this is getting into alternate history. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but bro, the situation, if Arbenz would have been allowed to complete his term, would have probably gone a lot better. I'm not saying that we wouldn't have moved, but there is still that possibility, because with increasing, economic um equality comes higher acceptance of socially liberal things. And that includes people with disabilities. I'm not saying there was absolutely nothing. I used to go to uh I think my mom calls it Funda Bien, but I think that it was El Centro de Invalidez, right in the center of Guatemala City, Zona Uno, Zone 1, right? It's basically, if I'm remembering correctly, because I haven't been there in about a year and a half, but it's like literally right next to the Central Bank of Guatemala. Um, and but again, like I couldn't go to pre-K without having uh a servant there with me, guys. Um, and I just do think, what if, because the thing is, there had already been um existing social democratic reforms put in place, like um that the 1944 to 54 revolution is the reason why, like, Guatemala today still has its labor protections, its system of universal healthcare for all workers, which, as I've said before, is it good? That's arguable, but once again, at least people, I think it's called like leaks or eeks or something like that. But people don't have to go into enormous debt just for a procedure. Do some people still elect to do private stuff? Yeah, I was born in a private hospital in Guatemala City. But yeah, guys, I do think about that. I really do think about that. And I think about, what Guatemala could have become if it stayed united with the rest of Central America, and but that's not the society we live in. But I'm glad that I got to read Capital, and a lot of it just like started clicking um with my experiences of poverty as a Guatemalan in the US, in the South especially. Um and I will say one thing though, and this has always kind of bugged me about Marxism. Even though, yeah, I know, even Marx himself said, I am not a Marxist. And I think he said that to his son-in-law Paul Lafargue, which I've already talked about him, but I'll get more on him later too. But but yeah, guys. I mean, Marxism is still. I do think it ignores certain. Like, I think it's too materialistic. I don't mean that in the sense of like greed or anything like that, because it actually speaks directly against greed. I just mean in the sense that, like, you know, there's a bit of determinism underlying the entire theory of historical materialism, as it is still based upon a critique of Hegel, um that honestly I don't think leaves room for the more abstract, the more spiritual side of humanity as being valid even outside of the um of the like framework, the historically materialist framework that Marx has set up. And if you don't mind me saying, I'm thinking of something that the German existential theologian Paul Tillich said in his book The Courage to Be. But it actually, in some instances, not in all instances, it can kind of become quasi-religious. He called it an eschatology of reason, right? That, you know, class conflict will end in this sort of, it almost sounds like almost end times ish in a Christian sense. And although Marx was ethnically Jewish, he was raised Christian. And I can definitely, even outside of the more obvious, like, speaking out against accumulation, and I mean capital accumulation, there it's literally like almost a 200-page chapter in the book. So, um, I especially with how a lot of Marxists um tied the this sort of progression of history and society and industry to eugenics in the mid to early 1900s. I still think that's one of its failings. People are might call. I'm not even religious or spiritual guy. Well, I mean, in my actions, I consider myself religious, but I'm not spiritual. Like, I'm a non-believer. I just think it's a worthwhile critique worth thinking about because it has unfortunately been used to justify a lot of stuff. So has capitalism, but we're not talking about that right now. And for those of you, because I know a lot of you are gonna be like, "Oh, you're a leftist. You're being biased, bro." I have Adam Smith. I bought books by Adam Smith. I bought books by Ludwig von Mises. I bought books by Milton Friedman. Relax. I haven't oiled my last day. I'll get to your favorite economist eventually. Um, but yeah, all in all, guys, those are my thoughts. I think, you know, um, Marx was definitely cooking. Marx was definitely cooking, guys. He got some stuff wrong, some stuff that I think he may have overlooked, especially in the non-material dimension of human existence. But like overall, um, I'm excited for volume 2 and 3, which I also have, but I'm gonna take a break. I'm reading Black Skin, White Masks by Franz Fanon right now, and I'm probably gonna continue after that to some other works by Paul Lafargue, which are not The Right to Be Lazy, but I'll come back to Capital Volume 2 eventually. Alright, see you guys, bye.